my name is Marian Petrov and I'm a Grandmaster from Bulgaria. Welcome to this course, which is dedicated to the Dutch defense. Dutch defense is one of the oldest and very popular openings against d4, and we're going to divide the course into 3 chapters in which I will show you different systems in the Dutch defense. So usually the move order is d4 and now f5. Although there are some people who start with e6 first move and then they go f5. But of course, if you play e6, white can play e4, so then you have to play French defense. After f5, the idea of the move f5 actually is to fight for the center. So black is trying to get control over the square e4, but not with pushing the d pawn, at least for now, but to play in the move f5, and after this he's hoping to play knight f6 and to get even bigger control over this square e4. So now white has different systems. Let's start with the move c4, which is the most usual reply against any answer actually for black. So now black has to play the move knight f6, which is keeping for him more options. And after knight c3, in this chapter we're going to take a look at the most popular reply, which is the move e6. Now in many occasions black will try to push d5, although he has also the option to play b6 or d6, as we will see later. Again, now of course white has different possibilities. If he plays knight f3, this is the moment when black has to decide which setup he wants to play. He can go d5 and then go for a stone wall. He can go b6, or he can go bishop b4 even, which is actually quite a popular opening, which is mixing some ideas with Nimzo-Indian and Dutch defense. Actually, the most popular move is bishop b4, and then it looks like Nimzo-Indian, but black has the advantage that here the pawn is already on f5. Otherwise she's usually on f7, and f5 makes a big difference because black has more control, like we mentioned, over the square e4. So I think now the most popular move for white is bishop to d2. And here he's hoping to capture with the bishop after bishop takes c3, not to double his pawns. But black, for black there is no need to hurry. He can play castle. And of course now if white plays a3 at some moment, black will take. But until then he can continue his development, and white also wants to save the move a3 because he's hoping that black will capture on c3. So usually white plays e3, and now b6. This is actually a very typical idea which you have to play if you decide to go bishop to b4. Otherwise, if you try to transpose now to stonewall with d5, then the bishop on b4 is actually not sweet for those pawn structure d5 and c6. He has to be on e7 or d6 in these setups. So the whole idea of black here, you can see, is that he wants to fight for the square e4. First there is a pawn on f5, then there is a knight on f6, then the bishop wants to eliminate the knight on c3, and finally the other bishop will go to b7. So now after bishop d3, bishop b7, castle. Here black can still play some developing move, but most people here prefer already to take on c3, although he can play something like queen e7 for example, or even d6. But because he wants to jump on e4, and if you jump now knight e4, obviously after knight takes e4, the bishop will be hanging. So if you want to jump on e4, you should take, and now knight e4. And after this, black can develop the knight on c6 or on a6, or he can play d6, knight d7. I think usually he plays d6. I believe this is the best move. And then the idea is to play knight d7 and then maybe queen e7, knight f6. Also sometimes there is an idea even to play rook f6 and then rook h6 and try to attack with queen h4. Sometimes knight g5 is an idea, and after knight takes, queen takes, you can attack on g2. So this is, I think, a very good line for black. So bishop b4 is a good setup for you. But if you still want to revert to the d5, of course you can do it. And now let's take a look at a few different setups for white. Here, if he plays bishop to f4, this is actually a very interesting setup for white. And after c6, e3, now black has to decide what to do with the bishop from f8. He can play bishop e7, or he can go bishop to d6. But in general, bishop d6 is usually good for white, because in the stone wall you have this pawn structure where most of your pawns are light squares, and you have the bishop on c8, which is usually very bad. And this is your good bishop, because he is protecting the dark squares. And if you trade your good bishop, this will leave you, of course, with a bad bishop. So white actually is hoping that black can play bishop d6. Most people now play bishop to e7. And after bishop d3, this is the best move for white. White has one interesting idea here after castle. Instead of playing the move castle and then just to play normal like rook c1, if you do this, usually actually black is fine after knight e4, for example. Let's say rook to c1 and now knight to d7. I think black has normal position for this setup. But there is one very annoying plan for white, which is the move queen c2. And white wants to castle queenside, and then he wants to prepare some attack with h3 and g4. Here I want to tell you about some very important detail in stone wall. So usually when white takes on d5, black always wants to take with the e pawn, because the pawn on e6 is not doing anything. So it will be good for you to take with her. If you take with the c pawn, this is usually not so great, because this is giving the square b5 for the knight. Let's say if you go knight d7, and now white takes. If you take with the knight, this is possible, by the way, but if the bishop now retreats somewhere, this will give white later to push e4 and to destroy your center. If you take with the c pawn, like I said, now white can play the move knight d5, and then he has a pressure on the c file, so he can jump on c7, on d6. This is not so great. So in order to avoid this, usually when the bishop and the queen are on this diagonal, black is playing knight e4. Now hoping that, let's say, white will play h3. And now usually he plays knight d7, and he can meet now maybe g4 with the move knight f6. And here black more or less is fine, because he managed to defend everything. He is able now to take with the e pawn, and then everything is fine. But the problem could be if white plays after knight e4 directly g4. And here black has some problems. Obviously if he takes, then white can play knight e5, and this is very good for white. So usually he plays moves like knight a6 with idea knight b4, and after a3, because white is preparing to castle queenside, black is playing queen a5. And now castle is not possible, because black will take on c3 and on a3, but simply white can play king e2. And it turns out that this is a very unpleasant position for black, because white wants to play rook to g1, and then h4, he can take on f5, and he has attack on the king side. His king is quite safe in the center, and black actually don't have anything. He has no coordination. The knight on a6 and the queen are a bit out of play. That's why this is a very dangerous line. Some people here play the move g5, but after bishop e5 I'm not so sure about this position as well for black. So I was trying to figure out now what can black do, and I think maybe the most interesting move for me is knight h5. At least we can try to eliminate this bishop. Now g4 is not a dangerous move because after knight f4 already black has advantage. Now maybe you can take on c4 and then you can take on g4, and white has very weak pawns. So at least g4 is not in the agenda, and if he plays bishop e5 you can play knight d7, and if now g4 I think you can simply take it because the knight is hanging, and it looks actually, even after this check, it looks okay for black. King h8, and now if white, for example, tries queen g6, and now black has many options like rook f5, maybe even knight e5 is a good move, and after knight e5 you can play simply knight f6 and to collect the bishop. So knight h5 I think is an interesting move which can try to prevent this idea with g4, which is otherwise very annoying. So let's see now what other setups white has in this position. After e6 white can play as well bishop to g5, just like he is doing in the queen's gambit. So now d5 is not a good move because after pawn takes, white can take on f6. So first we have to prepare this with the move bishop e7, and only then you can think about d5. Let's say now after knight f3. Again black has this choice between b6, d6 and d5. Even maybe knight e4 there is some line like this, but let's say d5. Now already with the bishop on g5 this setup with g4 is not so dangerous, so usually white plays e3, castle, bishop to d3, c6, and now if castle, again you go just knight e4. So after, let's say after bishop takes, queen takes. I told you that usually this is good for white to trade the dark square bishops, but actually there is no way here to prevent it, as if you don't play knight e4 there are not so many options. So here you have this nice outpost for your knight. Now usually white also tries to use his outpost, but now you want to exchange this knight. This is a very standard position in Dutch defense, and probably now the best for white is to play f4. If he takes on d7 you can take with the bishop, after f3 you take on c3, and it looks okay for black. If f4, then you always have to take this knight. I think if you have the chance you have to take this knight, because this way white has to double his pawns. So now usually he takes with the f pawn, and now for example you can play bishop d7, and then you can play queen to g5. I think at some moment white has to take this knight, and I think black has a good position. You can double your rooks on the f-file, you can prepare in different moments knight takes c3, and then maybe even you can take on c4 and push c5. There are many plans for black. Probably white has very slight advantage because his bishop is better than yours, but this is his only advantage, and I don't think this is enough for white. And in this position, if white tries queen c2 to do again this plan with g4, like I said, you can simply play this move, because now g4 is nothing. You can play whatever you want. For example, after g4 probably you can take on c3, or you can play knight a6 again. There are many good options for you, and you can simply defend the pawn, and after he takes on f5 you can take with the e pawn, and your king is safe.